a bit quiet.
Sorry, man. Is that better?
That's better. Go ahead, Rudolph.
Sorry, man. Sorry for wasting your time. I'm really struggling. Also from South Africa, Sir Anthony. Nice to speak to you. Can you hear me?
No.
It's too soft.
Too soft. Can you speak up, please?
Maybe this can help. Is that better?
Yes, a little bit. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm phoning all the way from South Africa, so this is probably why it's doing this. The question I have is, in the beginning of your presentation, Sir Anthony, you've basically given sort of the sort of fundamental understanding that what withholds sort of a consensus unity between Islam and Christianity is the fact that we both need to agree basically on a set monotheism. The question I want to ask first of all is, do you truly believe that Allah and Yahweh, as depicted in the Quran and the Bible, is succinct and is sort of the same God that have been depicted? And how do you deal with, for instance, different sort of concepts within the Quran and in the biblical scriptures? For instance, that the God of the Quran cannot have a son, for instance, as we see the Bible confirms that, or even a concept like the God of the Quran is not a spirit, where the God of the Bible is a spirit, for instance, and so on and so on. So the first question I have is basically, in that sort of assumed unity that you sort of describe, is there then in your understanding that the Allah of the Quran and the God of the Bible is one and sort of identical being? The second question I sort of want to ask is, if you basically look at intermediary figures, and you've sort of mentioned that God creates sort of a corollary towards to express who He is in the universe, the question I want to ask with that is, when you look basically at the understanding of sort of the Unitarian God, what do we need to sort of look at when we look at this unitary being? Because if God is ultimately only a unitary being and He expresses Himself only through an intermediary or a shaliach or a theos anor or anything like that, is He then therefore dependent on the universe or ultimately distinct from it? Whereas the thing that I find is that when I look at sort of the approximate sort of understanding of biblical Unitarianism, the problem that seemingly arises is that ultimately God has to lean on His creation to make Himself ultimately known, and doesn't that lead to a form of deism, where God is absolutely distinct from His creation? Yeah, that's basically the two questions I have. I hope I made sense, and I hope I was loud enough.
Well, you certainly were loud enough. There was a pronoun that wasn't clear at some point when you were talking about God and His shaliach. But I think I get the gist of your question. What was the first one about? About Islam.
Islam and Christianity being succinct.
There are differences between the Quran and the Bible. That is obviously clear. I've been in the mosque and we have friendly dialogue. Of course, the Quran doesn't agree with the Bible in many areas. Am I going to talk about Allah being this, that, or that God, and the God of the Christians being this? If I knew for sure, I wouldn't say. I'm not going to make enemies by saying your God is false God. That's not going to be helpful. I won't say. But clearly the Quran is not the same book as the New Testament. That's absolutely clear. However, they do insist that God is a single individual. However you define that, and that happens to be the Jewish view. I'm actually quite shocked by exponents of the idea that Jews are really binitarians or Trinitarians. That's contrary to all the evidence that I've been able to muster, talking to all the scholars that I've been able to find. I know about the two powers. I don't think that's right at all. Jews to this day will protest that they're Unitarians, and I think Jesus was a Unitarian. That's where I start, and that's really where I finish. So that's the point. The second question was about God and deism. We're not deists at all. I think God is fully active with creation. He was in the Old Testament. He's fully active with His creation now, using various agents. He used Moses. That didn't make him a deist or God a deist. He works through Moses, He works through the prophets, and in these last days, please note carefully, He spoke in the times of the prophets, through prophets and other ways, but at the end of those days, in these last days, as distinct from the pre-New Testament time, He spoke in one who is a son, not a mere man, for goodness sake, a unique son, and He's virginally begotten. Does that help at all?
Yes, I think what I'm trying to say is that the biblical Unitarian God is only God as long as he sort of communicate himself or manifest himself through another being. And for me, basically, Unitarianism therefore defaults essentially into an impersonalistic worldview, a worldview which is ultimately not governed by a personal relationship, but by basically the unknown, which is basically agnosticism, if you want to call that. So ultimately, if God leans on an intermediary, so you agree basically that God is ultimately dependent on his creation to make himself known. And that is basically the point I just wanted to bring across.
I see your point more clearly now. I don't think he leans on anything. He has chosen to do this, and he can do that. If you're God, you can use an instrument to speak to men. He used Moses, the prophets, and he then used a son, but not a son in the Old Testament time. The huge mistake made by Trinitarians was that they read the son back onto the angel of the Lord. Jesus was never an angel. That's quite clear. So I don't agree with your philosophical premise there. I don't know where you're getting that from. God is God, and if he wants to speak to us through agents, let him do it.
Yes, and I will also say that I've basically sort of studied quite extensively sort of the understanding of divine counsel and sort of the angel veneration in Judaism, as well as the son, as well as the sheliach, or the basic concept that Everett Ferguson is basically speaking of when he speaks about this intermediary figure, and also great human figures that is sort of the semi-divine figures that is found within instant Judaism, like Enoch, Elijah, Moses, and also the concept of theos honor. But ultimately, all of them basically agree to one thing, and that is that when we look basically at the understanding of Christ, he basically in the scripture, and specifically in the New Testament, attributes to himself different prerogatives that is ultimately not seen or known through these sort of Second Temple sort of figures that is evident within Second Temple Judaism, which sort of leads us to the understanding that if we can make a cumulative case, ultimately that when we look at sort of the earliest church fathers and their understanding of intermediary figures versus the person and work of Jesus Christ specifically, we can see quite clearly that scholarly consensus is basically agreeing emphatically. And even if you go read, for instance, a nuanced work from Noah Wiener, where he describes sort of the understanding of the Shema, sort of in Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, even he agrees that in the Second Temple period, sort of the Shema, Yisrael text in Deuteronomy is sort of a monolatric statement more than basically an emphatic statement of the oneness of God. So I would deem and say that Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4 does not lead us anywhere to a place where we can sort of predicate an understanding where God is negating that he is absolute one. And the scholarly consensus is basically that even though there are these intermediary figures that are prevalent even in ancient Judaism, that ultimately the person and work of Jesus Christ in the New Testament is not attributed or not to be agreed upon as seen solely through the foundation of a basic agency. And that you can go have a look at guys like I said, Everett Ferguson. There's a guy by the name of Benjamin Summer that have done quite an emphatic good work on the divine counsel specifically, and he's a Jewish scholar, where he specifically speaks on this divine counsel and ultimately the sort of work of Christ being made known, not only through agency, but Jesus attributing to himself the right and the divine prerogatives in the New Testament that is ultimately problematic for a very staunch Unitarian perspective. Also the work of Lawrence Strackenberg.
I fully agree with that. And let me ask you a question. Do you think that Paul expanded, created a mutation in the Shema in 1 Corinthians 8? Yes or no?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't
Yes.
hear. Sorry, my line is bad.
One of the standard arguments is that Paul was the one who mutated the Shema, expanded the Shema, reformulated the Shema in 1 Corinthians 8. Do you agree with that position?
Oh yes, yeah. I would say if you study actually what Paul did is Paul actually incorporated linguistically, and if you do a study of the actual Greek words that have been used in the Shema and how that sort of is portrayed in 1 Corinthians 8 verse 6, you can clearly see that what Paul is trying to do is Paul is trying to show us that the equivalent saying of the Shema is basically the understanding that is given to the person of Jesus Christ.
The same thing was happening. When Jesus agreed with that Jew in Mark 12, Jesus, and the Jew were agreeing to the split Shema, if you like.
Yes, I would say that.
That's logical, certainly. But you see, your fellow giants in Christology, and you're obviously very well read, disagree with you fundamentally. This is my great point against them. They say that when Jesus recites the Shema, it's a unitary monotheistic thing, agreeing with the Jew. However, Paul is the one who splits it. Now, you don't agree with that position.
I would say the following. I would say that obviously the standard for our sort of endeavor of study of 1 Corinthians 8 verse 6 could not be a scholarly consensus, because I can find just as many scholars that would obviously delineate and say exactly the opposite of what we've just surmised or heard you surmise.
Yes.
I would say the following. I would say what was Paul's intention, and obviously if we look and if we believe in, and I'm not using this in a Calvinistic sense because I'm not a Calvinist, sort of sola scriptura, that sort of the scriptures is sort of a rule of faith for what we believe and understand, then we can look biblically and we can see that the actual interpretation of the text is giving us light and understanding as to that the very reason that Paul is actually harboring this sort of interpretation of the text, that this is obviously done in such a peculiar way that he is describing the reality of Christ and God as being the full revelation of this one God of Israel.